Will you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, we give you thanks for this day, the opportunity to gather and to learn together. May all of our reflections, conversations, be a blessing to you and to the world around us. Amen. On this morning, we have come to our midway point of our study of Acts. Our midway point in our book gives us a shift. We move from our primary person being Peter, of the 12, who's been directing the movement that Jesus started since his resurrection. And so far, we've stayed pretty close to their small little world, to what they had known. And every movement, every moment in the story seems to stretch them just a little further. And this week, our reading has shifted from our protagonist, Peter, to the person who just 2 chapters ago was named our antagonist, Saul. Saul had been actively participating and approving of keeping his religion pure. Saul, not yet known as Paul, just to keep things confusing throughout our time together. Saul was a Jewish zealot, not unlike some of the very conservative evangelical Christians you might see today. He was so committed to his cause, so committed to what he knew was truth, that there was no means too great to reach his ends. He was doing everything literally and right. This isn't the person we normally expect to have a transformation. The story is Paul's, and it's influenced all kinds of people, of what they think it means to be saved and to be living for Jesus. And see, there are many Christian traditions who don't believe you should be baptized until you've accepted Jesus into your heart. I had a young person that I worked with once who was waiting for that emotional encounter with Jesus before he was willing to be baptized and confirmed. My cousins waited to accept Jesus into their hearts. They were still pretty little. It's what someone asks when they ask if you're saved. They're looking for a date, a place, a moment, maybe even a particular preacher, to pin down that moment you went from who you are and who you were to a child of God, from sinner to forgiven. And while the words are all very technically true, I remember being 11 or 12 and understanding that I was in so much need of forgiveness, that it brought up so much in my own life that I realized I must be terrible. I must be the worst person ever. When Martin Luther talks about all of us being part sinner and part saint, I clearly had all of the sinner aspect. And so I prayed my prayers, and I accepted Jesus into my heart as often as possible. Time and reflection have revealed I was a pretty good kid, actually. And such moments in my life have actually influenced me and my relationship with God for years and years to come. I think about conversion experiences. I think about those moments when I was sitting in worship. I spent a good part of a semester hanging out with the Campus Crusaders at my college. And every weekly gathering, someone would get up and share their testimony. It was usually about how they might go drinking, or smoke, or even sex, which are clearly the worst things for any good Christian kid. Or as adults, we hear stories of people who've been involved in a myriad of things that have been considered wrong or unsafe or unhealthy, and they tell how they, like Paul, had an experience of Jesus and that they will do better and that they are new, that they are different people than the person they were before. And this does happen. And praise God that it does. For there are people who have had an experience that has kept them safe and clean and restored relationships, but this narrative has been so fetishized both in our churches and in pop culture, we love a good redemption story. From the darker the places, the better. These are the stories of Ebenezer Scrooge on Christmas morning, but that's not Paul on the road to Damascus. Saul, or Paul, was a zealot with a very narrow view of Judaism. He had a very clear understanding of doctrine and dogma. Paul's conversion wasn't from one religion to another or from sinner to saint. It was a widening of his mind. It was an expanding of his theology. It was the ever reaching out of a small movement from one place to everywhere. Yes. Well, yes, Paul was a Jew. He was also a Roman citizen, which means that when Paul became the evangelist, this little movement in this little city of Jerusalem would start to reach all that Rome touched, which was everything. And Paul was going to have to grow. He was going to have to see these followers, these Jesus people, not as the other, not as some outside group, not as something that would ruin everything he had worked for, but that they had a place, they had something to offer, that there was good news in the story that they told and the life that they lived, and that he could be a part of it. The divine interjected into his life and said that the world that you see is too narrow. It's too small. Let me show you how much there is. And his life was never the same. And those early followers had to grow too. See, with every story we have in Acts, the blessing grows from a little small group to more and more and more people. This small community of who Jesus had known, who had walked with him, who had talked with him, studied with him, to those who the disciples knew and who studied under them, to the whole city, to those who had been considered impure in their religion or by their actions, and it just kept expanding to everyone. It was no longer a group of people who were just like each other, but it included religious outsiders, ritually impure, and Romans, and it wasn't going to stop. And what it was going to make them, the question, what was it going to make them if they reached out to other people? And I know what you're thinking. We know people in churches like this, the ones who need some kind of divine intervention so that they can expand their minds, their hearts, and their theologies. Maybe if they only knew someone who was, or if they could just experience some of the same things. I think it's very much human nature that we think that those with actual troubles are over there. And that we have it figured out. And Plymouth Church, there is so much that we do well. But of course, there are always ways in which we can learn and grow and be part of the mission and ministry that is already at work. We must continue to find ways to throw open our doors and invite new people in to share the stories that we have. For when in our lives Christ became real, for what the church means to us as individuals and as a community, we share those stories as if they are lightning moments of transformation, or maybe they're more subtle moments, a shift in direction. And in that, we welcome the new. And we remain vigilant. Paul had a breakdown on the side of a road. And the next things that happened was that he was invited into a community, and he spent time studying and in fellowship before he dusted himself off and got back to work. We know that there are moments of breakdown. I've had them. I'm sure none of you have. Or if you have, I'm sure yours are less serious than mine. But you might not have been blinded on the side of the road. But maybe there was a moment that required change. We know these moments exist in the world around us. See, Paul was lucky. His moment was brought forth by the divine. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes it's a friend who speaks truth into our lives. And when it is us, we have to make a decision. Are we going to dig in and stay where we've always been, or are we going to let it open us up to the new world around us? And it's hard. Often breakdowns come after hard work of trying and struggling and sometimes failing. Church, we try hard. But sometimes it's waking up to the news or to the election or to a Supreme Court ruling, and we realize one more time we haven't made it yet. Sometimes there's literally nothing holy about our breakdown at all. There's a moment that brings us to a point of change. It's Charlottesville, Standing Rock, Charleston, Pulse, Oak Creek, Parkland. It's every community that has ever been visited by trauma and violence and hatred, and these breakdowns are not divine. But there is a moment when those who have been hurt, when they decide who they will become afterwards. Who is the community that will gather with them? What do they study? What gives them hope and courage and strength to get up every day and to dust themselves off and to march again, to walk, to tell their stories? And we get to ask ourselves, hopefully we get to ask ourselves, how do we support them? How do we make space for their stories and sharing our own? It's a small course correction. It's a small voice speaking up with hope. It's a chance to study and learn and grow and expand. It's a new course with all that we are riding on the wind. For friends, we are people of hope and new life. We know and believe that any breakdown doesn't last forever. We open wide the arms of this community, of our church, to welcome any in need of good news, any in need of strength and courage, in need of a community, a place to be whole. And we are a community striving to be that beloved community, to live it out in ourselves, in our families, in our church, and in the world around us, waking up each day to live as church. May it be so.